In this video, I'm going to demonstrate how I sew an eyelet, and we're going to start by looking at some of the tools. I have a number of different awls for making the hole through the cloth, starting with the smallest. This is, I think, bone. This is the one I've had the longest, and actually the one I use least because it's incredibly small and actually quite uncomfortable to hold. But were I to make or need to make very small holes, this could be very useful. I also have one in what I think might be ivory, but probably bone. In truth, I'm not really sure. Again, mostly for display purposes rather than actual use. If I'm demonstrating eyelets in a living history context, I tend to use this one, which is one of Torm trader Dave Budd's tools. Now, this is actually, although it's graduated, it ends up being quite a wide circumference, a wide diameter, and I don't always, in fact, I very rarely want a hole that large. If I'm doing them at home for speed, I tend to use this cheap one available from the high street, because it doesn't matter if it gets lost or damaged. It's also what I think is about 5mm in diameter, and I think makes the perfect size of hole. Next, the sort of needle that I use. I have hundreds of needles, as you can imagine, but this is, if I can get it to actually focus, is the one I use most often. It's a size 3 embroidery needle, and again I cannot get it to focus. Oh, nearly had it there. It has a very long, wide eye. There we go. And it's about 4.5 centimeters long, almost a millimeter thick in terms of wire, and has a very sharp point. It does make for very strong tension. So my preferred size. More importantly for it is the bit that everyone will then see, what I actually sew the eyelets with. Now, this is a standard skein of embroidery thread. Comes in a wide variety of colours, is extremely inexpensive, and purists will obviously realise that it is 100% cotton and therefore not really suitable for medieval, but it does make an excellent compromise. If I want something better, I have a number of options available. Now, wool isn't really strong enough, wool thread isn't strong enough to hold the tension required to pull the strands of the cloth apart, and nothing more frustrating than it constantly snapping on you. Linen is strong, but not nearly as pliable as silk. And I have two different sorts of silk that I use, both of which from Torm trader, the mulberry dyer. She would be able to tell you in greater detail about the variations of it, but, and if I can find an end, I might be able to show you. It's stranded in the same way that the embroidery cotton is, which spreads very nicely to fill round the edge of the hole. Obviously not everybody in the medieval period would have access to silk threads, but if you're doing something very nice, it does make a lovely finish. In this next section, I want to talk about where I sew the eyelets. And firstly, I want them as close to the edge of the garment as possible. This has several benefits. It allows you to lace it much tighter together, but also flatter and smoother. But I don't want to be sewing through large amounts of seam allowance. So what I actually do is I trim away the seam allowance down to just under half of it. So that is approximately 6 millimeters, whereas the seam allowance is usually 1.5 centimeters or 5/8 of an inch. And that, if you can see, leaves just enough that I can sew the eyelet close to the edge without sewing through 4 whole layers in small parts of the eyelet, and makes it flatter and smoother. Next, I want to look at the spacing of the eyelets. The period pictures show lots of variation in spacing. Most of them tend to be roughly the same, but some pictures of doublets show closer spacing at the bottom and even offset spacing as it goes up. Some doublets are, again, tightly laced at the bottom, but only have 1 or 2 eyelets by the throat. So we mark them up. And as you can see, I've pinned a tape measure to the front of a doublet. And I'm going to spiral lace this one. Now, where there is a waist seam, again, I've cut away the seam allowance along part of that seam so that, again, I don't have a large amount of bulky seam allowance sitting inside and getting in the way of the eyelet. And I start by marking either side of that. Now, you can just about see where I've done that. And it helps to mark both sides at the same time. If you tried to eyelet one side of the doublet and then use the spacing of that to mark the other side of the doublet, you'll find that the eyelets have puckered that side that you've done just enough that it's not quite the same size as it was to start with. So I mark them at the same time. And again, you can choose your spacing, but it does help to get as many in there as possible. Certainly no more than 3 centimeters apart. If you go for more than that, you can't lace it tightly. You'll get a sort of drawstring effect as you pull the lace through it. So I mostly go for either 2 to 2.5 centimeters. Again, a little bit depends on the length of the garment edge that I'm lacing, because I want the top and the bottom ones to be in a certain position. I don't want a big gap at the top or a big gap at the bottom if I can avoid it. And certainly when I've got a central seam along the waist, as in here, then I need to position them quite carefully either side of that so that I'm not trying to eyelet through a seam. So I've marked my first one just there, and then I mark, in this case, 5 centimeter spacings all across upwards. I can then use the tape measure or do it by eye to mark the halfway position between the 5 centimeters. I think it's worth mentioning here that I don't sew the eyelets sequentially. You can, when sewing through several layers of fabric, occasionally pull a slight twist if you haven't poked the hole through straight, so that your lining and your outer sit slightly further apart than they should do. And if you then sewed every eyelet in order all the way up, one after the other, you would just end up exaggerating that twist. So I will sew that first one, and then I might sew one that's 10 centimeters further up the garment, and so on. And then I will come back and I will fill in the one halfway in between, and then the ones halfway in between those. And so that if I have got a twist, I'm not exaggerating it. On this doublet, I'm lacing in pairs. Now, this is seen in fewer images of the period, but you do see it. And it's worth at this point talking about where the holes need to be. Now, the holes themselves are approximately 2 centimeters apart, and I tend to mark the middle, if you can actually see that white chalk mark, of that, and then sew just either side of that. But The ones that are important are the ones at the top, because you don't want it too close to the throat, but nor too far away from it. But very importantly, at the bottom, you want
Oh, she's
a
doing the
pair
eyelets, isn't she?
at waist height position that corresponds with the lacing through the doublet for the hose. That stops, if that was kind of in the middle there, what would happen is that the tension from the hose would pull the edges of the doublet apart. If it lines up, you've got a bit of extra strength. It's not really important, but it's useful. Before I actually demonstrate the sewing of the eyelet, there's just a couple of things I wanted to show you. And first is the result of what happens if you cut the hole rather than poke it with an awl. So here is a hole that I've cut. You can see it's ended up as a square because I've just made 2 snips through twice the cloth. And I've stitched it in the way that I would bind an ordinary eyelet. And you can see the exaggerated result, which is what happens when you've cut away excess fibres rather than pushing them apart. And this is a very weak, misshapen, lumpy, clumsy eyelet that you could practically use a piece of rope through. It might be useful on much thicker cloth, but certainly on anything clothing weight, it's not very good. If your holes, for some reason, are already cut, there is a way that you can get round that ever so slightly, and that's to use a buttonhole stitch rather than just a spiral binding stitch. I tend to find that if you do these ordinarily, they end up really, really tiny inside because of the extra bulk of the knot that forms the buttonhole stitch inside. You don't also use as many stitches, which obviously makes it quicker, but doesn't give it the strength needed. So here is a finished example of a poked hole versus one where the fibres have been cut. Okay, so I've threaded my needle with approximately 12 inches or 30 centimetres of thread. That's more than enough for sewing one eyelet. And I'm going to poke the hole in the cloth. Again, the edge of the seam allowance is there. I want to pull it back just a few millimetres, 4 or 5 millimetres back from the edge of that seam allowance, and then I poke using a twisting motion, and I can take that out. Now, some cloth is much springier and those fibres will immediately start to close up again. If it does close up while you're sewing the eyelet, you can simply poke it through with the awl again. And if it closes up but you haven't realised how small it's got, and the hole ends up quite tiny at the end, you can just at that stage still just poke it through with the awl to enlarge it, and it will more or less stay in that position. Okay, so the first thing is that I use a knot in my thread. It's how most of us were taught, but it isn't actually a medieval thing. There is no evidence of knots in the thread. But it does allow us to always know where that end of the thread is. And so when we put it under tension to pull the fibres apart, we don't accidentally pull the entire thread out. So I'm going to show you a tip that allows us to have that knot, but that we don't leave the knot in the cloth. Because if the knot is there where the tip of the needle has come out, it's at risk of poking out through either side of the cloth, especially if your cloth is a fairly loose weave. But if it's underneath the stitch itself, it makes a really unsightly little lump. So we're going to start with, put it on the outside of the cloth. Obviously, we're not going to leave it there, but this way we know where it is, we know where the end of the thread is, and it's much more difficult to pull that knot or pull that thread out of the cloth. Okay, so we go through obviously both layers of the cloth, and you want to come out, it's about 4mm or just over 3/8 of an inch, but very close to the first stitch, or to the beginning thread. And to make a really good eyelet, you want to have your stitches really quite close together for strength, for neatness. And you simply do that all the way around. It's not exactly rocket science, but the trick is making sure that you're pulling it tight so that you're pulling the fibres from where they would be at the centre several millimetres further out. So we want to give that a reasonable tug, obviously without breaking your threads as you sew. And then you can see now the hole has started to close up a little, so we can repoke it. And we just twist that through there. Okay, the hole is back open again. Trying to keep this in a position where you can see it on the camera. The camera is focusing on it. There we are, that's better. But that I can peer around the camera to actually see what I'm doing. Because trying to work out where my hands are in relation to the cloth in the camera screen is actually quite difficult. Okay, and we just go round. And it does, I find, help to turn the cloth as you go. On a big bulky garment, that's harder to do. But, and again, I'm pulling quite tight there. And push those fibres up and out of the way. And so that you just repeat that movement. Now, I have very strong fingernails, and I tend to use my thumbnail as a guide to where the needle ought to come out. It does occasionally result in the needle going up underneath the nail, which is quite painful, but it also allows me to hold it in place. If you have a particularly long thumbnail on that side, I would imagine that's quite a lot more difficult. Okay, and you can see as we're going round, come on, focus, that is now starting to show a good round shape. And again, still pulling those threads firmly, but not putting the thread under so much tension that you're going to snap the threads. This is also why I tend to use just one length of thread per eyelet, because if you have a much longer piece of thread, first of all, it'll get tangled much more easily, but also every time you pull the fibres through the cloth, you risk weakening it. So if I were to have enough to do another eyelet on top, individual strands of the cotton or the silk, but usually definitely the cotton, tend to break off, and then you've got to deal with straggly bits. Okay, so we're getting towards the end, but we're not ready to quite give up yet. We've got a few more to do. because although that's now filled in the hole, we just want to go over it one more stitch just to bind that edge. Okay, I hope I've managed to keep that in the camera well enough. I do apologise if I haven't. So now we want to go through to the back to finish it off. Okay, so turning the cloth over and keeping that tension reasonably tight, we're going to do just a little stitch to start with through just the linen. We don't want it showing on the other side. And then one long stitch, again, just underneath the linen. And I tend to come out, for simplicity's sake, on the edge here. That leaves a nice long thread that's not going to easily pull out. And being on the edge is much easier to cut off. And I've not gone this side of the wool, which is always nice to see. And I can cut that off. I'll just grab the scissors. Cutting that close. Okay. Now we can deal with that knot that we've left on this side. We don't need that anymore. So we simply just pull that through ever so slightly and cut it off, if I can get hold of it, just below the knot. Okay, and that then long tail disappears inside the garment and you wouldn't have known it was there. Okay, and that is one eyelet. That seemed like an awful lot of waffle beforehand just to show you one eyelet, so I thought, well, I'll show you another one. And this time I'll do it in the stranded silk. So, sorry, let's not knock the camera. So we poke our hole and keeping the knot on the outside, we come up. Okay. So I'm not going to talk all the way through this one in the same way. I'm going to do it trying to keep an eye this time on the camera so that it's in focus, in the light, and hopefully a bit easier for you to see, just in case the last one wasn't always perfectly clear. I was trying to work out the other day just how many eyelets I might have sewn since I started this business. And basically I haven't a clue, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's somewhere in the region of 15 to 20,000. For example, just in stock on the stall alone, at the moment, I have garments where the number of eyelets adds up to 1,500. And that doesn't take into account, obviously, all the ones that I've made previously that have never even made it to stock. You know, they've been orders or whatever. And I've been doing this business nearly 20 years, so it is entirely likely that 15 to 20,000 might even be quite a conservative estimate. Okay, now you can see here that I was too busy trying to get going too quickly, and I've ended up with quite a gap between those two. Now, just to make that neater, I can actually fill that in at the end. Obviously, if it was round this side, it would be much harder to do because you'd end up with the thread going across the hole. But because it's quite close to the start and the finish, I can do that. So, and now we do that little stitch to start with at the back, and that just allows us to pull that last thread tight. And then taking an even smaller amount, and again making sure that we've not gone through the cloth on that side, push it right the way through to the edge and pull that tight, so that that last stitch practically disappears. Okay, and then we cut that off, and again, if you put that thread under just a little bit of tension, when you cut it off, it springs back and completely disappears inside the cloth. There we go. Thank you very much for watching. Once I've cut that off as well, that is how I sew eyelets. Thank you very much.